All right, so we are now moving into our week 7 content. As you will see from the slideshow, it's quite short compared to most of our other lectures. In general, there's less work to do this week for the chapter itself, and that's by design because you do, of course, have the midterm, which is open on this Friday, October the 13th. So I wanted to make sure you had a little bit more time to sort of study for that. In terms of studying for that, I don't think it would be much help for me to put out a study guide. Essentially, what I would be telling you to do is, well, go look at the slides, make sure you've listened to the lectures, and of course, do take advantage of the glossary that the course webpage has. So here in the A to Z, I mentioned this before, but in case you missed it or forgot about it, you go to the glossary. There's this set of terms, and you'll see that for each set of terms, it has a link to the week in which it's used. You don't necessarily have to click this. This is just informing you that, okay, this is something that we covered in a given week, and so I'm kind of responsible for knowing its definition, something about it, right? So I'm not sure that it's organized alphabetically rather than by week, which is a little bit of a hassle for study purposes. But if you just go through and study any term that is for weeks 1 through 6, then you'll have gone a long way to sort of getting the answers to all the questions. So in terms of the structure of the midterm, I'm leaning towards making it possibly all multiple choice questions, if only to simplify and streamline the grading process. There are 49 of you in this class, and so each weekend I have to sit down and read through and grade about 200 separate submissions. And of course, in the week where you had the thesis assignment, those took incredibly long on their own to grade. It took me about 2 days to do that. So if I included a number of short answer questions, while short answer questions are better for evaluating your deep understanding of things, I'm just not sure that I have the time to grade a whole bunch of short answer questions. So you do have short answer questions in the quizzes, and so in those I'm doing a little bit of evaluation of your deeper understanding of things, just to see whether you can support answers that you give to questions. So it's very likely that the midterm will be all multiple choice. Maybe I'll put 1 or 2 short answer questions on there just to mix it up a little bit and just to make sure that I can gauge a deeper understanding rather than just your knowledge of terminology. But given that it's going to be largely multiple choice, it will be very helpful for you to go through this glossary and see the definitions for these things, because definitions lend themselves to multiple choice questions quite easily. So go through the glossary, look back through the slides. If you remember there being a particular bit of a lecture that was a bit thorny for you, go back and watch that. If you, for some reason, haven't watched the lectures, I mean, what are you doing? You're supposed to be watching the lectures. I'm not going to say that they're entirely necessary, but they're, I imagine, at least incredibly helpful for understanding some things. And it is sort of the only place where you get more specific explanation of the chapters from the textbook that aren't covered in the reading sequence assignments. So if you have any questions while you're going about studying for the midterm, please let me know. I do want to help. make sure that you ask them to me before the end of the day on Thursday. So preferably before about 5 p.m. on Thursday, ask me your questions about studying for the midterm and what's going to be on it and where should I look for things. Because once I stop regularly checking my email on Thursday, it's a little bit late, and on Friday, I'm just not going to answer any questions like that at all. Once it's possible that someone has taken the test, I'm not going to answer any specific questions about where you should look for things. And in general, when you ask me questions on email about this sort of thing, I'm not simply going to tell you the answer. I'm going to tell you where to look for the answer, right? It's part of my devious plot to trick you into actually remembering these things and actually learning them is to make you go find it for yourself. If I just tell you the answer, you write it down, it's going to go in one ear, you're going to take the test, and it's going to come out the other, right? So I don't want that. Now, to the matter at hand for this week. So we are in week 7, and the next 2 weeks will be about the same topic, philosophy of mind in a very general sense. So we spent a couple weeks, as it were, down in the mud doing ethics, close to the ground, doing things that you may have stronger opinions about, which are more part of your everyday experience. Now we're going back into the sky a little bit here with philosophy of mind. Now, the mind-body problem is, amongst philosophy of mind issues, something that you might have an opinion about. Why? Well, because it's about whether there is something more to us than our bodies, or how can we explain that there is something more to us than our bodies if you happen to believe that. So that's what we'll be looking at. We'll be looking at whether or not it makes sense to talk about a mind being this non-physical thing. And so thinking of it that way, it may interest you a bit more, right, as opposed to this very abstract philosophical problem. So we're going to look at this week essentially 2 sides of a correspondence, of a series of letters between very well-known philosopher, not just in philosophy of mind, but in general, and then a sort of, amateur is technically the right word, although that has a negative connotation. So it's between René Descartes on the one hand and Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia on the other hand. So she was an intellectual. She wasn't like a professional philosopher. She wasn't a faculty member of a university or anything like that. But I don't mean to suggest that she is, because of that, less correct. In fact, as we'll see, most people in the debate have taken her view, have said that she is right and Descartes is ultimately wrong. So let's get into that. So this fundamental problem in philosophy of mind is called the mind-body problem. And a great illustration of this is, as I've said, a correspondence between Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia and René Descartes. And you can see from, they were born the same year, and they died not too far apart from each other. Descartes died, about a decade earlier. And so the problem is sort of arising, and Descartes is sort of writing about this at a time when sort of mathematical and scientific methodologies are becoming more advanced, right? So at the beginning of the so-called Enlightenment period, right? Descartes is a French writer, and Descartes is most famous for the phrase, "I think, therefore I am," right? So you've probably all heard that. That is from his work, A Discourse on Meditations on First Philosophy. And he's sort of trying to he's trying to argue against the radical skepticism that we looked at a couple weeks ago. That's not what he's doing here. He makes these arguments that we're going to look at in the same book, but sort of towards a different purpose. These come later in the book than the famous, what's called the cogito argument, "I think, therefore I am." So these two people have a correspondence about an argument for a distinction between mental and physical substances. So that's what we're looking at here this week. Princess Elizabeth says that Descartes' argument ultimately doesn't work, right? That there is a sort of fatal flaw in his argument, that it can't really explain something that really needs to be explained. It creates a problem which is insoluble, right? Insolvable. And as I said, most people, as history has progressed, have seen that Princess Elizabeth's side was the more correct one. She had the right of the argument, and that Descartes was sort of trying to defend a position that really couldn't be defended. So what is Descartes' argument? Descartes' argument is what we're going to look at here in the lecture, and then Princess Elizabeth's argument is what you will look at in the reading sequence. So there's only 2 readings for this week. Like I said, less work than usual because of the midterm. So Descartes gives a couple of arguments for the distinctness of the mind and the body. So what he is doing is trying to show that the mind and the body are really 2 separate things which have different properties, right? So we're going to look at 2 separate arguments for that. So let's go through the premises. First, premise 1. My body has the property of being such that its existence can rationally be doubted by me. So he's saying here, remember when we're talking about radical skepticism, the idea that maybe I don't really have hands, that I'm a brain in a vat, that there is no external world. He's saying my body, being this extended physical object, is something which I can doubt that it exists, right? I can imagine, in some sense, that I don't really have a body. Premise 2. My mind does not have the property of being such that its existence can be rationally doubted by me. So here he's saying, well, my body can be doubted. I can think, well, maybe I don't really have hands. But what I can't do is I can't think that I don't have a mind, right? And so this is where that I think, therefore I am thing comes in. Descartes' famous contribution is this idea that the very act of doubting, the act of attempting to doubt that I exist, where I doesn't refer to my body, but some thinking essence of mine, that very act proves that I do in fact exist, because I have to exist in order to doubt, basically. So when he says, I think, therefore I am, he's saying that mental activity is something that could not be, that I could not be deceived about, right? I can be deceived about specific beliefs, right? I could believe that such and such is true and it's not, but I couldn't believe that I am being deceived, or I can't believe that I am being deceived falsely into thinking that I exist, right? Because I have to exist in order to be deceived in the first place. That's kind of the way his argument goes. So, whereas it's rational, according to premise 1, that I could doubt I have a body, it is not rational, according to premise 2, that I could have a mind. So that's premises 1 and 2. Premise 3. For an object, for objects A and B, if A equals B, then A and B have all their properties in common, and there is no difference in their properties. So as we'll say, this is a statement of a well-known sort of, I guess, metaphysical thesis, and I'll come back to that in a minute. He's basically saying, if 2 objects are the same, then they have all the same properties, right? If 2 objects are identical, then there is nothing which is different between them. Conclusion 1. My body has a property that my mind does not, namely the property of being such that its existence can be rationally doubted by me, and therefore, conclusion 2, my body does not equal my mind. So my mind and my body are distinct because one has a property that the other doesn't, right? That at least is fairly straightforward. Here's the second argument. Premise 1. My body has the property of being such that it is divisible, that is capable of being divided into like self-subsistent parts that are also component physical bodies. So what he's saying there is, for instance, I could chop off my finger and it would be a thing, it would be a finger, or it would be a hunk of flesh or something. it would exist on its own as something, right? And I can, I could lop off various parts of my body. I could, going down to the microscopic level, I could divide different cells from each other, and the cell is still its own thing, right? We don't have to argue about whether a finger is a finger when it's detached for hand. It's still a physical object, right? That's all we need from this. So we could pull apart any physical object, and it would have, smaller parts which were still recognizable as something in their own right. Premise 2, my mind does not have the property of being such that it is divisible in the comparable sense as that above into self-subsistent parts that are also component minds. So here he's making a claim that your mind is sort of this unified thing, right? You can't chop your mind up into smaller parts, which are then identifiable as a distinct thing, right? So you can pull a finger off and, well, it's still some kind of object on its own, right? It's a detached finger. But you can't sort of pull out part of your mind and say, oh, well, this is something all on its own. That's what Descartes is claiming, okay? This second claim here may not be as intuitive as the first one. And as the textbook suggests, there are a number of difficulties with these arguments. But nonetheless, on the basis of these two premises, Descartes suggests once again that my mind does not equal my body. Conclusion 1. Premise 3, only entities constituted by like parts are capable of being destroyed. Conclusion 2, my mind, unlike my body, is indestructible, from which it further follows that the mind or soul, unlike the body, as religion teaches an article of a faith, is immoral. This kind of comes out of left field here. So premise 3 is saying something like only divisible objects can be destroyed, right? So the reason why the body can be destroyed is because it can be chopped up into a whole bunch of different parts. He says, well, if something can't be chopped up into a bunch of different self-subsisting parts, then it can't be destroyed. This is basically not clear at all, right? It's not clear that this is true. So Descartes does have a vested interest in defending a particular sort of religious view because, well, historically he's just in a period of time where where it's expected that you're kind of going to include God in these arguments. For another, he, in his anti-skeptical arguments earlier in the same work, kind of gets us out of the radical skeptical situation by saying, well, look, God exists and God wouldn't deceive us, right? So he goes through this whole rigmarole of saying, well, imagine that there is some evil demon and the demon is deceiving us about all of our beliefs, right? So this is how he gets to the point, well, I could be wrong even that I have hands. I could be wrong even that I'm sitting in this place. I could be wrong even that there are external objects. The demon could, being sufficiently powerful, could deceive me of absolutely everything except for the fact that I exist. And then from this basis, Descartes attempts to show, well, I have a mind, and in my mind, he kind of goes for this ontological argument for the existence of God that we looked at from Ansel. He says, well, look, I have a mind, and in my mind is this idea of God, and this idea, because of its nature, means that God must exist. Oh, and part of this idea of God is that he wouldn't deceive me. And so, given that there isn't actually an evil deceiver demon, then God has ensured that more or less the way that I perceive the world is the way it is. And so, actually, I can be sure that I have hands. So this is a very compact and kind of roughshod way of explaining Descartes' argument, but that's essentially what he does. The existence of God is crucial for Descartes' argument to pull us out of the radical skeptical situation. And this is something which critics have said makes it fundamentally an unhelpful argument, and that it can't really prove what it intends to prove, so on and so forth. But this is by way of explanation of what premise 3 and conclusion 2 are doing in this argument at all, right? So they are not, premise 3 and conclusion 2 are not important in themselves for demonstrating the distinctness of mind and body, but here they are nonetheless. Okay, so let's look at the analysis. I've already mentioned some of this a bit. So premise 1 and premise 2 in the first argument are, as I say, carried over from Descartes' cogito ergo sum, which is I think, therefore I am. That's how it's said in Latin from that argument. So he argues the very act of doubting proves the existence of a thing which does the doubting, namely the mind. So for this, not even the most powerful of demons could fool you. You could, however, be fooled about the existence of specific characteristics of any material objects, blah, blah, blah. Analysis 2, the second part of the analysis of the first argument. So I said that this refers to a sort of metaphysical or logical principle, so let's go back here. For objects A and B, if A equals B, then A and B have all of their properties in common, and there is no difference in their properties. So this is a principle articulated by a German philosopher, Gottfried Leibniz. You can see he lived in a sort of similar time period as Descartes and Elizabeth of Bohemia. So the first argument is, as the textbook will tell you, thought to have incorrectly applied this principle, right? So while it is true that two identical objects must have all of the same like intrinsic properties in common, Descartes in the first argument isn't using intrinsic properties. So when I say intrinsic properties, so that's what he switches to in the second argument, right? Being divisible, right? That's something which is a property that objects simply have, right? They have that property even if no one is around to think about them, even if they're the only thing that exists, right? So if there's this big old, think of this big old block of Legos, and there's a universe in which only this block of Legos exists, well, it can still be pulled apart into its individual bricks. No one has to be around for that to be possible. That's just the nature of the hunk of Legos. It's made of little component pieces, right? So that's what I mean when I say something like an intrinsic property. However, in the first argument, he's talking about being rationally doubted. So that is not an intrinsic property. That's a property that two things kind of have to exist, right? So rationally doubting something is taking like a perspective towards it. And so there has to be the perspective taker and then the thing which it is taking a perspective of, okay? So he's applying to a property of the way things are thought about. And as the textbook explains, this doesn't really work very well, right? So I kind of explain it here. In short, what I think about you is not a property of you, right? What I think about you is a property of me, or it's a relational property between me and you. So if you are, that should say Green Lantern. I don't know what a lantern is. Okay. Green Lantern. If you are Green Lantern, but I don't think you are, I can't deductively prove that you aren't Green Lantern, right? So the fact that I think you aren't Green Lantern sort of has nothing to do with what you are. However, in this first argument, Descartes is sort of taking these properties of what he can think about objects and then sort of bootstrapping those up into actual properties of the object, right? And that's what he's doing here. And that argument doesn't work so well, which is why he has to go to the second argument in the first place. So the second argument is taken to be the more definitive one, the one that works better. And so, he invokes properties that are properties of the object itself rather than of the perception of the object. So being divisible is a property of a thing, right? So brick of Legos, rather than a property of a second object regarding the first one. But despite changing which types of properties he's referring to, the second argument works exactly the same as the first. It says, well, look, the mind and the body, they can't be the same thing because they have distinct properties. And things which have distinct properties can't be identical, right? So this empty can of coffee, well, it's made of metal, it's orangey yellow, and so forth. It can't be the same as this cup because, well, this cup is made of plastic and it's green. So they have different properties. They can't be the same thing. Descartes is saying, sort of more generally, that minds, plural, and bodies, plural, are generically not the same. So it's not just that my body and my mind are the same. It's that no body and no mind are the same. Because minds, in general, are characterized by properties that bodies, in general, are not characterized by. Bodies, in general, are divisible. Chop, 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 right? Minds, in general, are not divisible. So bodies can't be minds. That's basically where he's going with this. So there is and I think the phrase that he uses in the Meditations is a real distinction between mind and body. They are two different types of substance. And this idea of types of substance is what we're going to get into next week when we talk about monism and pluralism, or dualism in particular. So to kind of give you a preview of that, Descartes is putting forward what's called a dualist picture of the universe. That is, he says the universe is made of two different types of stuff. Physical stuff and mental stuff, right? And they are distinct from each other. To get a complete picture of the universe, you have to invoke both material stuff and mental stuff. If you leave one out, then there's stuff in the universe that you haven't talked about. Whereas a monist view of the universe would say, actually, there's only one type of stuff. And so science is usually explained as putting forward a monist view of the universe, saying there's only one type of stuff, and it's physical stuff. If you want to totally explain the universe, all you have to talk about is physical stuff. There isn't any mental stuff. There are mental ways that we talk about physical stuff, but there's only one type of stuff. Descartes says there's two types of stuff. And we'll get more into this types of stuff way of talking about things next week. For now, just look at Descartes' argument and then look at Elizabeth of Bohemia's objection to his argument. Her objection to this argument will sort of lead us into the talk about dualism versus monism and the talk about how different types of stuff could possibly interact. And that's what the mind-body problem is. That's what you'll see when you look at Elizabeth of Bohemia's argument. She's saying, if there are two fundamentally different types of things, how do they interact with each other? That's essentially the question that she's posing. So, as I said, the other side of the correspondence is in textbook chapter 77. So the Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia article is the thing which you will look at for your active reading assignment, your group discussion, and your individual summary. I still have a couple of people who aren't kind of getting this. You are only to refer to chapter 77 for this week's active reading stuff. That's what you're trying to find the thesis of and evaluate the argument of in the individual summary. That's what you're giving your reactions to with the active reading assignment, and that's what you will be discussing in the group discussion. So I managed to ramble on for quite some time over this very short presentation, and I apologize for that, but I did give you some information at the beginning about the midterm, and I've given you some extra historical context to Descartes' side of the correspondence. So if you have any questions about this, about the midterm, whatever, please do make sure to email me, especially with questions about the midterm promptly before the end of the day on Thursday.